Welcome everyone to session 11 of our Bible study into the parables of Jesus, many of the parables of Jesus. Today, we are coming to one, I don't know, I think of all the ones we've looked at this so far, this one I found like the largest number of interpretations about it. And so it leaves us with a lot of information and or baggage to have to sort through when we're considering this parable. And as I was reading it, in similar ways as we discovered in the parable that's called the prodigal son, the fact that this parable is called the laborers in the vineyard just so focuses our attention. Okay, it focuses us on the laborers, so that's whom we identify with. We tend to, when that's the title. And so what that does is many of us in the received interpretation we have of this parable, it's an allegory, whereas the householder or the owner is God, because we are so exclusively identified with the laborers. And so it makes it sort of into this, it just sort of narrows sort of the field of view, and we tend to look less at the ways this parable might challenge some very real world relationships that have to do with economics, for example. So there's that. The other aspect that can be helpful and or confusing is that whenever you mention a vineyard in a parable, it is automatically it brings up the very common references throughout the Old Testament and the New, that when you mention a vineyard, it pertains to a domain of God, a place that God is the owner of, because there's just the vineyard is a common image there. So again, it points us toward allegory, and allegory is not necessarily the most helpful or sort of the only way to look at this parable. Again, I need to say it, if you've received this allegorical meaning, it's not that these are wrong, it's just that our approach to parables is to try to do this. Wherever, since parables, the job of parables is to kind of get us to look twice. It's to get under our skin. It's to make us turn around, wake up, pay attention. So if it's sort of a nice, tight little package, and a lot of times allegories get us there, it's probably not the only thing that the parable was trying to say. It might be worth looking at separately. But what we see is, traditionally, if you look at some of the early church fathers who looked at this parable, they see this as a parable that has to do with salvation. Okay, so God, as the landowner, hires all these workers, the first one representing sort of Adam. And then it's, the next one going to pick up, say, Noah, and then Abraham, and then Moses, and finally Jesus and the Gentiles. That's sort of the progression. And that's a very common interpretation, at least in the early church. But what that does is it sort of sows the seeds of Christianity being the sort of superseding better religion than all that old stuff. Okay, and this is problematic, because it plays on some old stereotypes, and it sort of galvanizes these ideas that too many of us within Christianity have had, that, well, Christianity is better than the old religions. New Testament is better than Old Testament, that sort of stuff. And that is just, as we've looked at all of these things, not just in parables, but in all our Bible studies, I hope we've seen that it's not about that. And if we find ourselves getting that message, we need to kind of maybe look twice. It's helpful to look twice. Another interpretation that's very common is that, the first ones called are sort of the sort of complaining, grumbling Jews, or at least the Pharisees, the legalistic Jews, who see that, well, when I'm called and I do my hard work and I follow the rules of the law, I expect that I will get my just reward. That's a benefit to me, that sort of idea. And that the ones called at the end were sort of like the fishermen and the tax collectors. Again, an allegory that sort of represents the movement from the legalistic practices of religion to the grace of God that Jesus is talking about. But the danger here, once again, is that it just plays on stereotypes. It galvanizes some of these old antiquated ideas. And so whenever we have a parable, and if it's at once sort of, if our interpretation of it is at once making it this sort of liberated, all-inclusive thing, but then still one that plays on old archetypes of Jewish xenophobia, then it's probably not the most rich, meaningful. It might not be what it's trying to say. So then I found a really wild, not wild, but just ingenious, more modern interpretation that kind of goes that these, the idea that there's these laborers who are exploited, as we often hear that the economy in that time was one of exploitation, where there was a pyramid type thing and the people at the top had it good and then everyone else was fighting for what was fighting to survive. And that there's this, the sense that these impoverished workers, after they work all day, they come together to working, and when the landowner pays the last the same amount as the first, he's sort of sowing seeds of discontent, and the workers start bickering with each other, and it's almost a way of saying that the landowner or the householder is trying to prevent them from uniting as a group of workers, but that in the course of the parable, they see how they've been exploited by the householder, and then they, gives them a sense of new insight and power. Now, it's creative, but along with a lot of scholars, I don't think that that's what the first century Jews would have seen in this type of a parable. So for our purposes today, and I recognize that after I'm done talking here, I want to hear more from you about other ways that you've heard this parable interpreted, if you have. But what we're going to do is we're going to sort of try to not look at it as an allegory. We're going to sort of put that aside. We want to, so that's not about getting into heaven or salvation, that sort of idea. That we don't necessarily want to look at it as the exploitation of workers and this, how we deal with labor relations in these, extreme environments like this. Maybe not. Maybe what we'll do today is consider that this might be about relationships between householder and laborers in a sort of more regular economy, just everyday type stuff. Which is something that was common in the time of Jesus. That it wasn't a horrific economy until later, when Jerusalem was sacked in about the year 66. But throughout, many of the years where Jesus was preaching, people weren't sort of well off altogether, but they had what they needed. So he may not be talking about extremes here, but what if we saw this parable as what God would have us do, not to earn salvation, but to teach us how to love our neighbor? What if we looked at the parable like that? And one of the reasons why I like to be pointed that way, go back and read chapter 19 of Matthew, which is just before this. You've got sort of 3 or 4 stories, I think it's 3. First, he talks about divorce and why a man shouldn't divorce his wife. And what that does is it protects the economic viability of a woman in a day when a man could just make up an excuse essentially and send her off. And Jesus challenges that practice. Then he invites children to come to him and says, no, the weakest, most vulnerable ones, they're not even seen as full participants in society. He welcomes them and expresses their care in the fold of his reality and of God's reality. And then after that is the rich young ruler, the one that comes right up and says, what do I got to do? And Jesus says, it's about how you handle your possessions and let it all, follow the commandments, great, but then sell your stuff and follow me. And that economic, that very, nuts and bolts approach, that's something that sort of leads right into this, because Peter says, well, look, we've already given up everything to follow you. Where are we in all of this? That sort of thing. And that's when Jesus follows it up with the parable for today. So those are some of my initial comments. I'm going to allow you all to sort of maybe raise your hand if you have any sort of comments you'd like to make, or interpretations that you've heard about this parable in your lives so far. Bertie.
I do think it's about relationships, and that we should not be comparing ourselves to others. That really can lead us down a slippery slope of jealousy towards somebody else, or of desire for what they have.
Yeah.
And that can lead us even further down to complaining that we don't have what they have.
Yes.
And all of that, it really denies us the ability to be happy with what we do have.
It's a great point, and I think it's one that the parable does play on, because it's a very particular way that the householder decides to pay all the workers. And because of the way the householder pays the workers, it sort of spurs the question that you're referring to and the comparisons that you're referring to. So we'll take a look at that. Absolutely. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Marilyn?
Sorry, should have
There
been
you
better
go.
prepared. Well, I didn't think of this while I was reading it. I thought of this while you were talking. And that is, there are some ways in which the the early workers and how they felt about the way the owner was treating the later workers reminds me of the older brother in the prodigal son.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And I think I heard echoes of that too. I was going to wait till maybe the end to sort of see, are there any resonances that you're seeing with some of the other parables that we've talked about? But I think you're absolutely right. There's some element of that in that comparison, that sense of, for whatever the reasons are you ultimately going to be willing to sort of shift your worldview from self-centered to sort of more community-centered? And that's a challenge that Jesus plays on a lot. And I think in our world, where we tend to identify from, or we begin with this place of individual first, taking care of our needs first, our sense of success in our world has to do oftentimes, or at least the narrative we get, we may live differently, but the narrative we get is about self-centered first. This type of parable can certainly be directly challenging to us. Anyone else? Okay. Why don't I figured out how to share the screen. I just had to allow some privacy settings to be opened up. So I'm going to go ahead and read the text for today from Matthew, and you can follow along with me. All right. The parable of the laborers in the vineyard. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. And he went out again at noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now, when the first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I'm doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. And that last line, that is sort of like a tag that actually is at the end of chapter 19 too. So you can sort of see how the narrator, Matthew, is kind of connecting this with what goes in chapter 19. So, okay, anything stand out to you there, or anything different, sort of like what Marilyn experienced, as I'm talking and, you thinking, or you're reading this or hearing it for the first time, or not the first time necessarily, but another time. Anything come up for you? Bonnie?
Well, what flashed through my mind was the thief on the cross, that, it's sort of like with his dying breath, he acknowledges Christ as being, the Savior and etc. Compared to maybe those who had, the Pharisees or whoever, who had lived this upright religious life all their life. And it didn't seem to me that, Jesus made any discrepancy between the two. He loved the thief as much as those that had lived this quote unquote righteous life.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a nice connection there. I mean, when the thief on the cross sees Jesus, Jesus sees him right back. And the way of seeing each other and the categories that we see each other is what Jesus often challenges. And this parable may be challenging some of those categories as well. But I like the way it's those ones that lived a whole righteous life versus the one that sort of recognizes it on the bedside. Now, that idea can be offensive to a lot of us. A lot of us are like, well, geez, is that really, is it that easy? A lot of us ask that question sometimes, because that's the grace challenges our sense of what is fair sometimes. And maybe some of these parables are trying to play on that as well. Kathleen, I see you, but I saw Boyce first. So I'm going to go to Boyce and then Kathleen. You want me to help you, Boyce? There you go.
Well, one of the things that I noticed is that the first vineyard workers made a bargain. They had a contract, so to speak, that they would work all day and they'd get $1. Nobody else had a bargain. They took it on faith that he would give them what was right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of that, okay, is that saying, follow through with the bargains that you make. Don't complain. If you make a bad bargain, live with it, type of thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes people make bargains with God. Save my child and I'll go to church every Sunday, And yet the other workers, they just kind of took it in faith. They didn't even ask, well, how much am I going to get paid? But he did tell one group, you'll get a fair wage.
Right. That's a good point. Only the first group makes a so-called contract, or a bargain, as you call it, contract. They contract for a day's wage. Now, you might call it a dollar. A denarius is what it is. And that actually is probably enough, in the research I did, probably enough to feed a family of 4 for 2 to 3 days. So it's not just a day-to-day living, but it's not exorbitant, but it's enough to survive. Okay. It's enough to get what you need. Okay. And so the rest, you're right. He doesn't say, I'll give you a day's wage. He just says, I'll pay you what is fair. And it ends up being the day's wage. Okay. Kathleen?
Well, it ties back to sort of what Bertie was saying. One thing that reaches out to me is when he says, are you envious because I'm so generous? And I think that touches me, because sometimes I do get envious. And I just think that that's a pretty important statement there.
I agree with you. And I think that's one of the challenging places of this parable and so many parables, is that when we sort of enter into them, we tend to identify with certain characters. And I think that most of us probably step into this parable, and because of the title or because of the content, we identify with the workers. And not only that, I think we identify with the first workers in a lot of ways. You know, maybe we identify with multiple, but that sense that many of us have in the modern age, especially, you know, with that sort of rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. When you work hard, you get rewarded, all that stuff, none of which is bad per se, but it's of the world, and it's not necessarily what the community of God is like. So it's a challenge to us. And I think it depends on who we identify with that could lead this parable to sort of either insult us or offend us versus inspire us. And maybe it's both. And you know, I think parables, we do well to step into all the places. And that's why I think trying to put allegory aside allows us to maybe step into the role as even the householder. What if it's not? What if the householder isn't the divine? You know, what if it's just a wealthy landowner? Now, it could be the divine. I'm not trying to say, but it allows us to step into it instead of just saying, okay, well, that's God and everyone else. Yeah, let's look at it more deeply. What do you all? Oh, go ahead, Horty.
I just wanted to, there. First of all, I just read that when you're muted, if you put your hand on the space bar and hold it down, you will unmute yourself.
Oh, wonderful. Everyone hear that?
I thought that was kind of a nice shortcut.
That's so, thank you so much, Horty. Yeah.
I'm doing it now.
Okay, great. So everyone, do you hear that? Hit the space bar, and then you can mute yourself by hitting the space bar again after you're done?
You just hold it down.
Oh, you just hold it down.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, maybe that's so. So anyway, I wondered why, when he went later, he said, "Why are you standing idle all day?"
Mm.
And if they'd been standing idle all day, why didn't he hire them in the first place? He's assuming that they were idle all day, not that they had other things they had to do. But I just, I was curious about that turn of phrase.
No, it's a great question. And in the English, the word idle does definitely kind of connote this sense of sloth, or this sense of just kind of like waiting around, twiddling your thumbs. And in the Greek, the word idle is not that necessarily. And the point is, we don't know. We don't really know why these workers haven't been hired. They could have been helping their elderly parents and then just showed up later. They could have come from another town where there's no employment, and then it took them, you know, part of the morning to get there. Standing idly in the Greek is less about the inner kind of motivation of the person and more about just the reality that they haven't been used. They're idle. They're like an engine waiting to go. They're just not okay. So we have to be careful, because commentators can lay that on the workers, but that's not often, or that's not what the parable is telling us. And another thing is that a lot of folks, if you read some commentaries, it'll say that, well, the ones that were there at the end of the day, they were the older ones, the infirm ones, you know, they just weren't the prime workers. The parable says nothing of the kind. And in fact, the question that the landowner asks, or the inquiries that he makes, there's an assumption that they are all physically capable. They're physically capable workers. He's just saying, well, why aren't you working? What's going on? Okay, and then he calls them. Here's another question, though, that maybe we don't think of. What do you make of the fact that this householder is going so many times, like every 3 hours, to the market to look to find workers? What do you make of that? What is that what is that conveying to us as readers? Ken?
Well, what I always assumed was that he had a crop that was ripe. And when you're a farmer and your crop is ripe, you've got to get it in while the getting's good. But the other thing that I've always reflected about this parable is it seems to be a parable about justice. And I think one of the challenges that we face in society today is, in order to create a just society, it's going to feel like some folks are getting benefits that other folks aren't. We had affirmative action a few years ago, and there were people who felt like it was justice wasn't happening. People were treated favorably because of the historical past, and so affirmative action was often withdrawn.
Thank you. I don't know, did everyone else have some trouble hearing the audio on that? Yeah, it kept blipping out, Ken, I'm not sure, but I got the gist of it. So you're talking about some of the things that this parable does seem to bring up justice. And in our modern view, at least in the practice of affirmative action, that is the practice of justice in terms of reparations and acknowledging maybe a historical debt that has been owed to a particular class or race of people, in this case, people of color, African American in particular. But in this parable, it's not so much an affirmative action approach, is it? It's really a hiring. It's really kind of, it's not a handout, it's not a reparation per se, but it's just going out to the market to find workers. So it's slightly different. And yeah, I think a lot of us see, okay, he's a vineyard owner, it's harvest time, you got to keep going back. But when you read the parable again, he's not going back saying he's even looking for more. He's not going back saying, oh, I need more help, we've got more work, oh my gosh, I gotta go. He just keeps going back regularly. It's very curious. And so it leaves us with this question of like, okay, does he know what he's doing? I mean, is he just kind of that clueless that he doesn't really know how many workers he needs? Or maybe he has a different agenda here. What is the agenda? And at the early stages, we don't really know. But it's curious that this landowner just keeps going back and keeps hiring people. Again, not saying that he needs to hire them, but he's hiring people and, getting them to work at his vineyard. Okay. Any other comments about the early state? Margaret. Hit your space bar, Margaret. You're on mute still, Margaret. If you just hold the space bar down and then talk. Not yet. Here, let me see if I can help you out. There you go.
Okay. I wonder why he keeps hiring people. Why doesn't he say something to the ones that are sitting idle? Why don't he get after them?
Why doesn't he get after them?
Yes. Why doesn't he say, get to work?
Well, I think he raises the question, why aren't you working? And what's their response?
I don't know.
The response is we didn't get hired.
They say no one has hired us. And so there's this dynamic that's happening that work isn't just about them kind of working. There's these day laborers. And I think any of us who have worked in certain industries know what this is like. You go early enough even to Home Depot in Auburn, and you will see day laborers who are waiting to be hired to help out on various construction sites. It's part of the reality of the way certain industries work. Okay. Marilyn.
Well, I have sort of two reactions, and I'll try to talk fast so I don't take too much time. First of all, there are ways in which this is kind of reminding me of the situation we've got right now, with so many people who are getting unemployment insurance, don't have a job, aren't working, and because nobody's asked them.
Right.
So that's one thing. Then the second thing, there's some ways in which I find a parable like this very reassuring in my own life, because some of you may remember, I've talked about it before, for about 40 years, I wasn't connected with church at all. And it's only been relatively lately that I have become, and that it's become such a special experience for me. So it could be sort of easy. I guess, to point at me and say, Marilyn, why do you think God's going to accept you with open arms for 40 years? You know, you weren't even thinking about it. And so to read a parable like this, I think, oh, good.
The door's wide open. And I think there's something challenging there, but it can challenge for those receiving the grace and the generosity. It's a wonderful, liberating experience. But the challenge we've seen, both in the prodigal son with the older brother, and then these workers, the first hired, the challenge is what is our experience of that, you know, across all the varieties, you know, all those the workers in this parable. And their response indicates that they're struggling with it. They're struggling with the fact that they're made equal and that those people are brought into the fold in the same way. They're treated the same way. I saw Jay.
I saw it as more the God is looking for you, whether or not it's early in life or late in life. As to when you, not so much when he's to be hired, but he's looking for you to join his group or his flock, no matter where you are in life, as you've talked about before.
Yeah, even if you do look at the landowner as God, it does fit into that theme that we've seen in the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, of the God that seeks us out wherever we are to welcome us into the fold of God's grace and God's love. Absolutely. But then also, I like the metaphor of the landowner, even just from an economic sort of real world perspective, the landowner that goes out and seeks the workers, because that itself is an act of justice. So it wasn't just going out to give handouts, but going out to find people to hire. When you do what he did, that's an act of dignity. Okay, you're allowing people to not just stand idly by to wait to beg. You're giving them a sense of dignity, to be hired, to earn something, you know, so there's something there too. But having said that, in your initial read of this, what was your attitude? What was your reaction to the way that the householder paid the workers? What was your initial reaction? I'd love to hear that, because it can be all over the map. Carol first, and then Horty.
My first reaction was, how many times in my workforce did I have everybody comparing, how much an hour do you get? Do you have an expense account where you can kind of write some of this stuff off? There are websites you can go to and enter your information and find out what you should be making, what the mean average is for that particular job. And was my first reaction.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yeah, kind of touching on that comparison thing, that tendency we have to compare. And the comparison theme in this parable is really instigated by the way that the landowner pays the workers. It's really, so that's part of it too. Horty, did you want to add something? Oh, you're muted still somehow.
Sorry, what was his motivation for the order in which he wanted people to be paid? And so I didn't have an answer for it, but I just wondered, what's this about? Why does it matter? And it wouldn't be in there if it didn't matter, but I don't know what the matter is.
Well, it's a great point, and it matters depending on your vantage point. And so what I will say is, a lot of modern people, when they see that, they look at it as like, what a jerk to do that, because the landowner basically created the problem by choosing to pay the last first. If he had just paid the first and then gone on, then there wouldn't have been this comparison thing, you know, because the last would have basically taken whatever they got anyway. The first would have taken what they contracted to and gone on their way, kind of thing. But no, the way the parable's set up is to intentionally do it this way and to get under our skin. But that's a very modern read of this, I think. That whole sense of the comparison and what Carol was talking about, the way we're about, you know, what we earn and you know, what's in it for me. But then again, if you look at what the concern of the first workers in the parable, it sort of has a modern feel. Like, what is their complaint? What do they want? What do the first workers really want, according to what the parable says? There's two things that they say, and it's subtly different. Bonnie? I think I can't hear
Okay.
you. There you
Anyway,
go.
okay. Well, it, on a personal level, in this time, because of my husband's age, he was asked to stay home from work, while there were other people still working, younger people. And he was, telecommuting, but often the server was down, which was no fault of his, but he got paid just the same. While there's other people there that are in the office that are actually working as much as they can. That a lot of things have been shut down. But so I'm thinking, well, maybe the owner of the vineyard was looking at, and this is just speculation, maybe they are willing, but it isn't just the circumstances. It isn't their fault that they're not out there working in the vineyard all day long like other people were. Maybe they had reasons where they couldn't do that. And so in that sense, maybe he felt that it was fair, for them to get a full day's wage.
I think you're right. I think he clearly felt that paying them that full day's wage was fair. It was just. He even uses that word. I've been just to all of you. And I think you bring up another good point, and that is we often read into the fact that the people are hanging out at noon, 3, 5, all that, and just idle, that thing, because of that word, and it's not there in the parable. We lay a lot of those layers of judgment on the workers, but the parable just says they haven't been hired. Okay, it's not because they're slothful, lazy, listless, shiftless, all that. It's just that they haven't been hired. He asked the question. We might look at the question that the landowner asks and say, oh, he's reproaching them. He's saying, why aren't you working? No. What if he's saying, why? How could you able-bodied people not be working? What's going on? See, we don't see that, but we often lay that on there, and it really can color our interpretations of these things. So what the first people want, they start by saying, the first people hired, they start by saying, oh, well, we're going to get more money. We're seeing how all this is playing out. It's like, oh, we're going to get more money. But then what they want shifts a little bit. And what they end up saying is, oh, we're upset because you made those others equal to us. We don't want to be just equal. We don't want to have to, and a lot of us read into that as saying, well, what's the motivation? They slaved all day in the sun and they get the same thing, okay, as the last ones who worked for an hour. Okay, so who is in the right? Who is in the right according to this parable?
The landowner. The landowner, because he says he was just. He was fair.
Anyone else have another thing to say about that? Yeah, the parable very clearly says the landowner was in the right. He abided by the contracts that he made, and he acted generously to a certain group of people, to a number of people, but lived up to the contracts he had made. So the ones who are in the wrong then are the complaining workers, that they have broken this sense of communion with the other workers. Okay. All right. So if that's true, if all that stuff that we've talked about kind of leads up, so what is the message, or what are some of the messages that this parable is trying to communicate? And just for the sake of this conversation, let's try to leave allegory aside. Okay. So let's just look at it from a perspective of landowner and workers, and maybe real world example economics. Okay, let's think of it that way if you can. So what is some of the messages that this is telling us? Bertie? We need your volume still.
Sorry. The grumbling keeps the laborers from seeing the generosity of the landowner. And so a lot of it's about attitude.
Yeah, I think that it comes back to that self-centeredness. And when you talk about what it is that I get out of this, it's easy to lose sight that you got what you needed. You got what you contracted for, kind of what Boyce was bringing up earlier. So that's an important distinction, that there's this sense of that they got like so thrown because of the generosity. Okay, they got thrown by that, and they got into that place of thinking, I deserve more. I don't want to be just equal. I deserve more. Now that's a very modern, there's a lot of relevance, I think, that gets under our skin there, which is, and if that does get under our skin, I think that's a good indicator that we're into some of the meat of what this parable might be pushing. Okay. Or, well, it could also be meatless too for vegetarians. But so we need to stay there, I think, if this is making us uncomfortable. What are some other messages then that this is communicating to us, that you're receiving? Steve.
So one of the things that strikes me is that the landowner is sort of blind to the fact that he may be creating feelings of injustice in the workers. And the other thing that struck me is the workday is 12 hours long. It's a long time.
Yeah.
So I could see why a guy that's hired at 6 a.m. would be upset at being paid the same amount as a guy who was hired at 5 p.m. So yes, there's an innate sense of justice in workers, and they always compare themselves. So the landowner not seeing that, I think, is part of the problem here.
Well, the landowner maybe doesn't see it, or maybe knows exactly what he's doing to try to play on some of these comparisons that you're saying. I think what you just said is so true for most of us, that if we identify with those first hired workers, then we are offended. It's like, oh man, that's, whoa, okay, I don't know. It's like, all right, by the end, you're like, I get it, but still, that's not right. You know, we at least stay there a lot of times. And the way that the landowner behaves, it's like he's really trying to make a point here. And I think part of the point is that we live in a world that if you, those, basically the idea that those who have will get more. If you put in the work, you're going to get more that sort of correlates to the effort that you put in. And then it's about that. And that's not necessarily a negative, wrong image, but if that's the height, if that's the way we see our relationship to each other and to what success and well-being looks like, then it's very limited. And what this parable is trying to maybe communicate is that it's not so much about those who have. The point is, it's not those who have get more, but those who don't have get enough. And that's sort of what, because again, the day's wage doesn't make you a millionaire, but it makes it so that you can buy food for your family for a couple or 3 days. It makes it so you do well, you know, you can live. Horty?
What if, I was struck, Dan, as you were just speaking, what if we just stop at, let's pay attention to the fact that we live in a world of comparisons, and just increased our awareness of that. And that maybe in that there is no inherent right or wrong or just, but just we live in a world, humanity lives in a world of comparisons.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a part of this, that the message that to receive grace and to allow others to receive grace challenges our sense of relationship, and where we compare each other and we set ourselves up, almost stratify ourselves depending on what we think we deserve, positively or negatively. There's a whole nother conversation about that. But this parable is challenging those categories that we set up, those comparisons that we make, saying that that's not what God's about. And we focus so much of that energy and that time, and then we miss the generosity that is all around us because we're disconnected from the abundance that's part of the community. Because when we're like,
if we are all of the workers if we are all of the workers, then at times we may feel justified. At times we may feel slighted. You know, if we take the world of comparisons, not just to other, but to comparisons within ourselves, and look at the fact that we're all of everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really good to go back and read this and put yourself in the shoes of each of the workers, and then also the landowner, and sort of see how that shifts your experience of what it means to be in this parable, to receive the message of the parable. Anyone else? Any other messages that you're receiving from this? Peter.
Yeah, you were talking about staying away from metaphor and remaining in the real world. Anytime that I think anytime that people are suffering because of lack, there is a cost to society, which is maybe much more significant than sharing resources so that that lack doesn't exist in the first place.
Yes.
I think we're seeing some of that right now in society. And so in the kingdom of heaven, or in a just economic system, everyone would get enough. And the need to judge, which separates us from our brothers and sisters and ourselves,
yes,
begins to disappear.
Yes.
And the acceptance of love and oneness takes its place.
Yes. What if this parable was challenging us to move away from our assessments of our monetary earnings and some of those categories that we say create abundance in our lives? And what if we looked at this as being, what if it was about an abundance of dignity that gave us the fullness of our lives? Because that's what the landowner is providing. He's not going and doing handouts for all these workers. He is allowing them dignity to work and then receive what is enough to live. And so there is a huge abundance. What if we started to look at those categories of our lives that define what it means to be a success in this world, and saw dignity as the currency rather than money or some of these other, categories that it's all about us, that sort of thing? There may be something there that this parable is challenging us to look at, and again, that's one that's you need to chew on and kind of read it again and look at it and look at your lives and sort of see how it's all playing out. But I think that idea of the dignity that is preserved in all of these workers because of the way the landowner behaves, that's a powerful message. Anyone else? Anyone else that just has a sense of what other meanings come out of this? Yes, Boyce. I see you. Oh, yeah, I see you got frozen. There you go.
Am I on now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. The space bar does work. Looking at it just from an economical thing, from the landowner's perspective, it seems like he needs to get that crop in, and he's very anxious about it. So he hires these guys, agrees to a day's wage. Then he's running around trying to find more people, because as the day goes on, he's realizing that crop isn't going to get in with the number of people I have. I need more people. And so he's willing to pay a day's wage for those that are coming later, because his motivation is to get that crop in by the end of the day, or perhaps.
Okay. Oh, there you go. It froze for a second. I like what you're saying, but I think there's a little more speculation there. The parable doesn't really tell us much about what motivates him. He never says, oh, I need to go back and get more workers because the crop's so full. We may assume that, but I think, as you noted, when you said perhaps, it's like, well, it's not really stated. all we know from the parable is that he's just going back and he's looking. He's doing the work of seeking out those whom he can hire, whether or not he needs them. We assume he needs them, but he's going out and he's doing something. He's not just giving money to those who aren't working. He's saying, no, you come work. You come work, then I will hire you. I will. So we don't really know what the motivation is, aside from the fact that he keeps going out every 3 hours to look for them.
Well, it reminds me of a strike that we had, teacher strike. And during the teacher strike, the substitute pay went amazingly high because they needed substitutes to fill in. And so the district was willing to pay much higher wages to substitutes than the normal substitute pay because they needed somebody in those classes. So it just kind of reminded me, well, this guy, we need to get up. He didn't get he was going to be paying those people that he was hiring. He was willing to pay them a whole day wage just so they can get there and work and get his crop in. I don't know what the message is.
Well, I think the message is that he names it. I think he tells us it's generosity and it's dignity. And the challenge is that there's a certain class of people in this parable for whom that message doesn't feel like fair, because they're comparing themselves and the categories of their own self-worth and their own sense of success. And that is, they thought they should earn more money. When the point of the parable is, maybe the currency of God is not about money. It's about grace. It's about dignity. It's about calling people and not just handing out stuff, but it's about welcoming them into the fold of being able to contribute meaningfully to a society, to work, and then being able to have enough. And it's not trying to create these classes where there's certain people that are just able to get more all the time at the expense of others. Because the truth is, that's the way it works. There's only, so much that goes around. And in an economy like what we live in, the way the world functions, you've got to have the haves and the have-nots. And often, those that have a lot get more and more. And it's those that don't have anything that are scrambling to get enough. Well, in God in this parable, maybe in God's kingdom, it's just a different approach. It's a different approach where it's not about those who have get more, but it's really the point is those who don't have get enough.
It also seems like, if you're relating it to God, that the kingdom of God, no matter when you decide to join up, you're going to get the same reward.
That was going to be my point. My father was not a believer, but my mother always made sure that he took me to church and dropped me off. And I had the opportunity at the very end. I'm sorry, I'm going to get emotional over this, but I was in the room with him when he was in the hospital. He finally asked me, he said, "Okay, Darlene, tell me more about your Jesus." And I took him through that, and he finally said, "I want to pray with you. Would you pray for me?" And we did. And so when I read this, and that last line says, "So the last will be first and the first last." For me, that speaks God's grace. Does not mean that you have to be a believer from day one. It can be on a deathbed, and you will be in that kingdom. And I will see him in heaven. And so it's a different viewpoint than kind of maybe where you guys have been. But for me, that's a personal one.
Well, and I think
God's grace is there at any time for anyone. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, it's
at any point. And you have the same place in heaven with him. So thank you.
Yes, no, it's beautiful. And the categories, we can't we are not in the place to categorize what God's grace looks like. All of these stories communicate this wide open, beyond our rules and expectations and our efforts. That's not how grace works. And so these stories of God, these parables, even like this one, do communicate that ultimate message that you just named. And a lot of us, I think, when we've seen this parable through our lives, we recognize that there's that sense of, it doesn't matter if you were the first called or the last called, you are still welcomed into the fold of God. That is a powerful message. What we've been focusing on today is also adding the real world sort of aspects to it, because you can kind of make this only about that allegory. And again, I think it's powerful what you just shared. It's a very beautiful statement. And I think that's part of what the truth of parables like this are, is that God's grace is beyond what we all assess and expect. But other layers of this challenge us in the ways that we live today, and how our interrelationships and the economies in which we function in the world, how they are either serving or hindering the reality of God's way. And so all of that is being lifted up in these types of parables. And so today, we're left with the reality that we don't get to decide. We don't get to control God's grace, but we are asked to consider that in our lives, if we seek to live like God, it means doing things like that householder, going out and seeking out those who are in need, and not just doing handouts, but finding ways to dignify them, and that our strength and our connection to God and our relationships with each other has a lot to do with the dignity of all, as opposed to getting what I need. And that's a really challenging and powerful message. But if that gets under our skin, if that makes us sort of wake up, or it makes us feel uncomfortable, then that's generally what a parable is meant to do. Any other closing comments? Peter.
Way back when I was in teacher training, I saw a film, and Darlene, maybe you and Boyce and others have seen this as well, but it was meant to teach prospective teachers about multicultural students and how they thought and what their attitudes were. And so we were shown a film of two kids playing checkers. And in the checkers game, the winner got a chocolate chip cookie and the loser didn't get anything. And so we watched a couple of kids who were not of color play this game. And one student won 4 or 5 straight times and got the chocolate chip cookie, and each time expressed glee. And the student who didn't win got more and more sad and depressed and eventually angry. Then 2 other students were brought in to play checkers. And in a couple of minutes, we saw a difference. These happened to be Mexican-American students. And in the first game, same rules, one student won. But in the second game, the other student won. In the third game, the first student won. In the fourth game, the second student won. And it became obvious that they were sharing the cookies, and they were allowing each other to win to make sure that they each had enough. And it was an astounding example, a little bit of what we're talking about today, but also about how culture and how about people who are in need will share more with each other than those of us who often have more than enough.
Amen.
And it has stayed with me for forever. And it was just a beautiful thing.
Thank you so much, Peter. That I do think that lifts up some beautiful takeaways for this parable. And yeah, it's a lot to chew on with this one, friends. So I hope that's how it will play out for you this week. And I'd love to hear more. You know, if you feel motivated or you feel challenged after these classes, feel free to email me. We could kind of continue the conversation. And we do have only a couple more weeks left, but thank you all for the contributions today in this challenging parable. Next week, we will be continuing on. We have 2 sessions left. Next week's parable is called The Widow and the Judge, Luke chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. And I just want to say at this point, thank you once again for being here, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you, Dan.
As always, thank you. It's
Thank
been
you.
a privilege.
Hi.
All right, bye.
Thank you, Horty, for the space bar tip.
Yeah, that's a great one. Thank you, Horty.
Now we'll